Good afternoon. We welcome you to the annual Niebuhr Lecture for 2021. I'm Nancy Lee, Professor of Religious Studies here at Elmhurst University. By this lecture, we pay tribute to Reinhold and H. Richard Niebuhr, who were graduates of Elmhurst in the early part of the last century, and who became two of the preeminent theologians, social ethicists, and authors of the 20th century. H. Richard was also president of Elmhurst in the 1920s. Both brothers and their sister Hulda all became seminary professors at leading institutions in the United States. And as everyone knows, Reinhold became highly influential as a critical voice in the national political scene in the United States for many decades. Whether we highlight H. Richard's ethical emphasis on the social responsibility of the faithful to address the world's problems, or Reinhold's realist recognition of the limits and failures of human nature and his profound prophetic understanding that groups and nations, by their self-interest and abuse of power, including ironically America, tend toward injustice that damages the common good and now the common planet. For these reasons and more, the Niebuhrs remain relevant for our time. Never simply were they focused only on Christian tradition or only the religious sphere. The Niebuhrs, with others in the liberal tradition, always embraced empirical knowledge and truth from a range of disciplines, yet emphasizing we must be actively engaged to choose good over evil in the social and political spheres. They provided hope for change back then, and their work is still inspiring thinkers and leaders, now notably environmental ethicists and climate change activists and thinkers today. They are tapping into and adapting Niebuhrian principles for this critical time. With this lecture, we invite those who resonate with this legacy. And now, here to offer a greeting is Dean Pribenow.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, Nancy. My name is Dean Pribenow. I'm Vice President for Academic Affairs, and on behalf of President Troy Van Aken and the Elmhurst University community, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Niebuhr Lecture, and in particular to welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Arthur Petersen. I know we are all looking forward to your comments today. I was recently informed that the Niebuhr Lecture is one of our oldest, or actually is our oldest lecture series, and so I'm particularly honored to greet all of you today on this occasion, both because it recognizes the legacy and contributions of the Niebuhr brothers, but also because these lectures open up our thinking. They challenge us to look more deeply and critically at relevant issues of the times, issues that we know exist at the intersections of fields of knowledge, values and ethics, and lived experiences. Today's lecture, Climate Change, Science, Religion, and Public Policy, will, I'm sure, continue this rich tradition. While we all wish that we could be enjoying today's lecture in person, I also recognize and am grateful that our virtual format allows some to attend who might not otherwise have been able to. Having just celebrated my one-year anniversary at Elmhurst, the entirety amidst the pandemic, I have witnessed and been inspired by our faculty, staff, and students and their commitment to ensure a continuity of teaching and learning throughout this time. And I'm glad we have ensured a continuity of our lecture series, and I'm delighted that you are all here. Again, welcome and enjoy today's lecture. Mladen?
Thank you, Dean. The title of this year's Elmhurst University Niebuhr Lecture is Climate Change, Science, Religion, and Public Policy. And the lecturer is Dr. Arthur Petersen, Professor of Science, Technology, and Public Policy at University College London and editor of Zygon, Journal of Religion and Science. Professor Petersen studied physics and philosophy and obtained doctoral degrees in atmospheric science, Doctor of Philosophy from Utrecht University, and Philosophy of Science, Doctor of Public Administration at Free University Amsterdam. And soon he is expected to complete another PhD, and this time in theology from University of Oxford. Professor Petersen finds disciplinary homes in international relations, science, diplomacy, and soft power, science and religion, and philosophy of culture. Most of his research is about dealing with uncertainty. Professor Petersen worked for more than 13 years as scientific advisor on environment and infrastructure policy within the Dutch government. He served as chief scientist of the PVL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. Professor Petersen is also research affiliate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and visiting professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has been adjunct professor of science and environmental public policy at the Free University Amsterdam, professorial fellow at the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and the Environment, and visiting fellow at Osaka University, Japan. In June 2019, he was elected as a member of Academia Europaea, the European Academy of Humanities, Letters, and Sciences. On a personal note, I know the work of Professor Petersen primarily through him being the editor of Zygon, Journal of Religion and Science. Zygon is a quarterly peer-reviewed academic journal covering religion and science. It is published by Wiley Blackwell, and it is published since 1966. It's dedicated to the manifold interactions between the science and human religious and moral convictions. Articles published in Zygon cover ideas, theories, theologies, as well as practices, and address ethical issues and analyze the history of the differentiation between science and religion and their subsequent interactions. Zygon Journal covers the whole range of sciences, from cosmology and physics, biology and the neurosciences, sociology, psychology, and anthropology, and is open to religious and non-religious perspectives. Those rooted in the great religious traditions such as Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, but also to religious naturalism, secular naturalism, and atheism. Regarding the topic of the lecture today, in my view, out of many important issues that confront us humans as a species, the issue of human-made climate change is of exceptional importance because of the planetary scale and existential dimension that characterizes. Our scientific and technological process made that possible. And we also look to our scientific knowledge and technological abilities to address the crisis we create. Reinhold Niebuhr, in the title of one of his books, asked, "Does civilization need religion?" Perhaps we can answer Niebuhr's questions in a positive way if we think of religious traditions as a repository of distilled wisdom that our scientific and technological progress has made necessary. To help us understand the topic of climate change, science, religion, and public policy, I'm glad we have with us Professor Petersen to share his scholarly insight and wisdom that stems from his experience in public policy. Please help me welcome our speaker today. Arthur?
Thanks a lot for all those introductions. I'm very thankful for this invitation to give this lecture. The topic, you can see from the title, brings together, in a sense, many of my own selves. As a scientist, as a religious person, as a policy advisor, as a philosopher. I will briefly introduce myself first along these lines so you can get an idea of where this lecture is coming from and where it will be heading. So scientifically, I trained as a physicist, received first doctorate in climate science, found it very rewarding to do natural science at the beginning of my career. And it gave me deep insights into, well, first particle physics, but then physics and chemistry of the climate system. And with this latter study, I gained first-hand experience on how computer simulation can and cannot be used in the natural sciences. And specifically, some of the major uncertainties associated with climate science pertain to uncertainties in computer simulation. So religiously, I sometimes describe myself as a liberal Catholic Protestant, which I should explain, of course, with which I mean that I'm liberal theologically, I'm Catholic liturgically, and I'm Protestant ecclesiastically. So being editor of this journal that Mladen introduced, titled Zygon, this journal on religion and science, it doesn't itself lead to religious experience for me. I need liturgy for that. But I do consider the role rewarding in terms of being able to contribute to a global discussion on science and religion, as it is really relevant for global world problems such as climate change. So over the years, before my time as editor already, the journal has featured a couple of important special sections on the role of religion in dealing with climate change. And if you're interested in that, I would really invite you to take a look at the journal and find those sections. Those have highlighted the importance of religion for dealing with climate change, as well as uncertainties, of course, also associated with the religious values and how they impinge on climate change. Now, politically, I have for many years advised politicians and policymakers on climate change, provided them with information on what we know and what we don't know scientifically, as well as what the different societal perspectives are on the problem of climate change. So offering them policy analyses that are as complete as possible. Being chief scientist at the PBL Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency, also being a Dutch government delegate to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, those were really very rewarding on this front. And I've reflected on some of these experiences in the book that serves as my second doctoral dissertation that was mentioned for a Doctor of Public Administration degree. And the question that really concerns me in that area of politics is, well, what are the uncertainties really associated with making decisions on climate in climate policy? So today, what I aim to do is to share a couple of insights that I've gained over all these years about this vast subject of climate change, and in particular then about the interactions between science, religion, and public policy that are inevitably involved in addressing climate change. A large part of this task, or the task that I set for myself today, is to offer some philosophical reflection on these insights. So I have also a theoretical goal here, but one which I maintain has significant practical implications. So my overarching theme is to identify what this global super wicked problem, as you can call it, of climate change could mean for philosophy, that is for epistemology, ontology, philosophy of culture, philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, political philosophy. But please don't worry, I won't cover these all in any sense comprehensively. While my approach is philosophical, it's informed by empirical work from climate science, science studies, religious studies, policy studies, including my own experiences and contributions to those empirical endeavors. So I realize that I'm setting myself up for quite an ambitious task here, and that in the context of this lecture, I will be able only to offer you just a glimpse into my philosophical project. My third doctoral dissertation, a DPhil in theology from Oxford, should soon be available and will contain a full exposition. So let me offer you a sneak preview of the end result that I aspire to for my project before delving into empirics and highlighting for you some important building blocks in my philosophical position. So I argue for what I call transcendental naturalism. And naturalism can be taken synonymous here with empiricism, but I use the term naturalism on purpose to reclaim the term from those who oppose nature to culture. And I oppose versions of what I call scientistic naturalism, and I will explain that. The term transcendental is, some of you may know, a philosophical technical term relating to the condition of possibility of knowledge. It was first used by Kant in this sense. I'm not going back entirely to Kant, and it needs to be distinguished from the term transcendent. So transcendental empiricism, it may sound like a strange combination to some of you who may have read some philosophy, but it is actually a philosophical position that has been developed extensively a century ago by the German philosopher Heinrich Rickert. Now, a key consideration of this philosophy is uncertainty. So dealing with the problem of climate change requires, I claim, an overhaul of the self-images of science, of politics, of religions. That is, we need to fight the remaining certainties of Enlightenment thinking in all these different spheres. So the self-images of the practices of science, religion, and public policy, they need to become more humble, and one might say with the French thinker Bruno Latour, more earthbound. So let me illustrate then today how I think the philosophy of culture is relevant for thinking about climate change, even more broadly than science, politics, and religion, by starting with building a list of 9, it's not even complete, of 9 cultural domains that play a role in dealing with climate change, using terminology from Latour's mode of existence work. What I will do now is I will share screen so that you can have a view on some of the slides that may be useful to illustrate what I'm going to tell you. So if we talk about climate change and we talk about uncertainties, first I want to illustrate here in this graph that the uncertainties are really everywhere. They are arising from where the emissions are coming from in terms of greenhouse gases. There's all sorts of causes there. And then, of course, there is uncertainties on how these greenhouse gases will cause further warming, other climate changes, and how those are distributed geographically. And then you need to have a view on the uncertainties on the impacts of those changes. Now, in terms of different cultural domains of looking at this very super wicked problem, it's important to start, of course, with the sciences. The term Latour uses for that is the mode of reference. So it's the sciences that actually help us study this problem from all these different aspects, study the uncertainties, and get a real grip, a real sense on how this climate system is working. But if we then start to talk about dealing with this problem, we need to learn to think through, and that's another mode of existence, you could call it fiction. How would the world look like that is 5 degrees warmer? Why would you want to avoid that? How would the world look like that's only 1.5 degrees warmer, where we are, let's say, transitions to a sustainable society? All those things have a very important bearing on dealing with the problem of climate change. And there's a next interesting dimension of our existence. It's a psychiatric dimension. There is this question of, do we need to fundamentally change our ideas, our behaviors, our thoughts? Do we need to get rid of a demon? Do we need a metamorphosis here? There's a whole discussion we can have about that at the level of society, of how we are locked into particular behaviors that need change if we look at the problem of climate change. Then number 8, I said I was only going to list 9 of them. The number 8 here is this dimension of ethics, morality, economics. How do we connect means to ends? There's a large discussion to be had here about who is allowed, which country is allowed to emit how much kind of reparations will be needed from countries that have already emitted a lot of emissions, etc., etc. There are many different levels. There's many ethical, moral, economic questions that you need to deal with if you try to tackle climate change. Politics, very obvious, of course, but there's a problem sometimes with scientists when they approach politics. It's like, well, here's my result, and now you have to do something. While politics is, of course, the art and skill of getting a group behind you. So that needs to be done by people in that practice, and that impinges very much the extent to which that succeeds and the ideas that are offered there, the democratic processes, how they operate in different countries, and also the dysfunctionality of politics in many countries is a real obstacle in getting to the decisions that need to be made for climate change and dealing with it. Then we have the legal side. Of course, once you get to decision making and move in a direction of building regulation, or at the global level, building global agreements, that sets in motion its own sphere, its own mode of existence, this whole legal sphere in terms of how do regulations relate to constitutions, to international treaties, etc., etc. We need to get organized, again, at all these different levels, but also at the small scale in a university trying to become climate neutral. How do you organize yourself? How do you get things done if you want to deal with this problem of climate change? Technology, I work in the Faculty of Engineering Sciences of University College London, and we do a lot on different technologies, both on the climate adaptation, that's adapting to climate change, and the climate mitigation side, that's reducing the emissions of the greenhouse gases. So technology, building technology engineering is in itself considered by Latour a mode of existence. It's dealing with obstacles, building detours, making things work. Now, last but not least, I mentioned here this depth dimension of religion in terms of a mode of existence, and I'll get to more detail about and examples about how that also relates to climate change as a major issue for today. But first I want to say something about how it is, how it feels if you are trying as a kind of global community to deal with this problem of climate change, and having all these different modes of existence, all these different dimensions come together and play a role at the same time. What you see here is a room of a United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change meeting. I've been there for 14 years, representing the government of the Netherlands and negotiating. So I was kind of representing, let's say, the people of the Netherlands, and there were scientists there who not always agree with each other, who are representing, let's say, nature in a way, and different representations of that. And they have to come together. They have to have a diplomatic encounter here where their different values, the values of politics and the values of science, have to come together, because in the end, in this body, the scientists have written their reports, have written their chapters, but then there is a summary of about 20 pages, and all the 200 governments of the world have to come to agreement with all the authors there on any single sentence in the summary. But let me repeat, so all 200 governments have to agree with all the authors on the summary of the science of climate change. And this is amazing, and it's incredible that this type of diplomacy can work. And I think, and I claim, it's really important that these kind of processes exist, and there are guarantees in this body. It's chaired by top scientists. The order of speech is, on the one hand, a country may make arguments on why a sentence needs to be changed, but the order of speech in the end is based on science. So if you want to make a change, it has to be based on the chapters that are available. This is a fascinating process. I've been part of it, and I miss it now. I have decided to move to academia and leave my job in government. It's already 7 years ago, but it still feels fresh of being in these negotiations and trying to get the best out of these texts for the different countries. And the interesting thing is, different countries have different views on different political views on how they would like the climate change problem to be represented. So some countries are really interested in showing that this is a major risk that cannot wait to be tackled, which is kind of the consensus in majority at the moment. But there was an earlier moment where there were, let's say, a few countries pushing for as dramatic as possible portrayal of the problem, and other countries trying to downplay the problem and trying to kind of throw sand in the machine and slow it down. And they've never succeeded. And the Dutch government is always interesting. It's always chaired by a scientist. So other governments may have their environment ministry, or they may have their mineral affairs ministry leading these delegations. But the Netherlands always has a delegation where a member of the Netherlands Meteorological Office is chairing. I was here as a head of methodology, and chief scientist on infrastructure and environment, but not head of delegation. And here there was the policymaker from the Ministry of Environment. So that's how we did it. But the beauty is all these different values, all these different interests are represented there. And in the end, a better result comes out. To show this result it's a very important one. It gets updated every few years. So this year, there will be a next round of IPCC reports. And this is the burning amber diagram that gets updated regularly, where what you see is a temperature scale, for instance, on the right-hand side. This is from pre-industrial temperatures. And then for all these different temperatures, for instance, 1 degree, for 5 aggregate indicators, it's shown how high is the risk, or how high will the risk be if global temperature is changing to a particular number. So already now we are approaching 1 degree, and that means that for unique and threatened systems, we are already at moderate risk, and there are some, like coral reefs, that are already irreversibly damaged, even if we won't have higher temperatures compared to the 1 degree that we have now. But we're talking about, can we limit it to 2 degrees? Because if we do nothing, we will end up at 3, 4, or 5. So you can use these kind of indicators, these graphs, to see what will happen with extreme weather events, what will happen with how these impacts take place in terms of how their distribution is over the globe. Is it negative or positive in terms of global aggregate impacts? And will there be large-scale singular events like very, very quick melting of, for instance, parts of the Antarctic, and then the sea level rise that comes from that? So what we will need to do, even already now, because we have caused this climate change, it's a tragic situation that if we stop emitting now, we have already started it, and the warming will be continuing until the ocean is in equilibrium with the kind of radiative balance that we have now, which means there will be continued temperature increases, and we will have to adapt to climate change. And it's not always easy at different locations and for different systems. And we will face irreversible systemic changes, which means that the more you mitigate, the more you kind of still prevent future emissions from occurring. And increasingly in the discussion, that's a very interesting topic also for, let's say, science, religion, and public policy. There's this possibility to take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it underground. And there's more risky options of trying to simulate volcanoes and try to block sunlight through that by spraying particles in the stratosphere. It's not something you would want to do, but those discussions are coming up now. The warming is continuing and really getting well, way too large. So what to do? What to do is, of course, reduce the emissions, and there are shown here, there are pathways to do that, to really reduce the emissions and to go down. These are the annual emissions, and you really have to go down to zero in the end, globally. And it now seems to be the case that the more you miss kind of this curve, it means that at some point you will have to have negative emissions. You have to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And the final slide I want to show you on, let's say, the environmental studies side of climate change, the different options that are there. There are so many, and the issue is we will need them all. So we have to be very careful with saying we don't like nuclear energy, so let's not do that, or we don't like to take carbon out of the atmosphere. In the end, it seems we will need everything, which doesn't mean you have to do unwise things like scaling up nuclear energy. I'm just talking here about, for instance, this option of not, let's say, closing a nuclear power plant, which can still be used. But that's a very interesting discussion, because there are so many other problems with nuclear energy, and the real reason you don't want to continue that industry and expand that is, of course, also the nuclear non-proliferation issue. So there are many intersecting issues here. There's a whole lobby from the nuclear side, and it's important to really realize that there are many different factors playing there, and it's at most, it's one of these wedges. So if we take it out of the equation, it means we need to do more, and sometimes we won't even know what it would be. Now, an example, I would like to give an example of how religion gets into this discussion in this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that was a very interesting intervention at some point by one country that said, Mother Earth is not in the text, and our country has it in its laws that everything we do has to respect Mother Earth. There were issues there with, for instance, for negative emissions, converting forests into crops for producing energy crops, and then getting the CO2 underground. And they found that particular kind of proposal, kind of new approach to colonizing from countries that had emitted and then are trying to grow crops and produce negative emissions. And they have a law in that country which includes Mother Earth, and that needs to be in the text. That was the kind of the claim. And those kind of discussions then are had very interestingly. And the scientists, they don't really know what to do when these interventions come. And in the end, after a few days of negotiations, of course, there is a way then to kind of spell out in acceptable terms for the academics and the scientists how Mother Earth, which itself didn't make the text, could still be represented indirectly. So the sentence then in the end became that indigenous, local, and traditional knowledge systems and practices, including indigenous people's holistic view of community and environment, are a major resource for adapting to climate change. This was a report on adaptation to climate change. So that is why this is on adapting to climate change. But this also pertains, of course, to the mitigation report. Similar kind of solutions have to be found if particular countries' delegations bring up these concepts that have both the religious connotation and in this case also a legal connotation in that country. A second example is something I studied in a project that I ran in South and Southeast Asia, where we studied how knowledge on dealing with climate change is transferred through global networks from the Netherlands, the UK, France, Japan, to countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, and Myanmar. And one thing we discovered, and we were kind of surprised, we didn't expect that all the countries in that region adopted the Dutch approach to dealing with climate change in the Delta. So we have a scenario thinking, we have a Delta plan, we have a whole integrated methodology that we export all over the world in terms of how to deal with climate adaptation and deal with the water. There was one country in this region that didn't buy into that methodology, even though the Dutch tried, and that was Thailand. So we studied more closely what could have been the cause of that being so difficult there. And we had a tentative hypothesis, and in the end, I think it was just strong enough in a sense to survive a harsh peer review, and we got it published, but we said it was because of Buddhism compared to Dutch Protestantism. And of course, this is just, let's say these are icons and you have to get into the nitty-gritty details, and it's not one factor, but yes, there is a difference in terms of how you think about the future, how you do planning. If you have an idea of progress, if you have an idea of and a history, as we have in the Netherlands, of how we have been dealing with the water. And yes, Thailand has been a very interesting country. And the difference with the other countries was it had not been colonized. So the public administration system in Thailand is intrinsically connected to their model of Buddhist kingship. And that had ingrained in it ideas of sufficiency economy and other approaches that we identified very specifically in terms of why particular institutions did not want to take up scenario thinking for the future, but were very much more interested in measurements of the past. and dealing and making decisions on that basis. So that was another very interesting example I found on an interaction between religion and science and public policy on this topic of climate change. In terms of that larger discussion, I would like to refer you, if you're interested in some articles on this link between climate change and public policy and religion. We have in Zygon a couple of thematic sections that deal with that topic. So I can really recommend you to take a look at that journal, which both Mladen and I are very proud of to be affiliated with. So let me switch gears a little bit because I want to give one more detailed example of an interaction between science and public policy, and also then different interests, political interests coming in how the IPCC writes these sentences, because I think it's important to realize how that works. So this is bringing in some of my earlier background on climate simulation. Here is a kind of sketch. This is weather radar of a storm system over the North Sea. Then this is a kind of size of a grid box in a climate model. And there may be, let's say, regional models, there may have smaller grid boxes, but the important thing is it's still at the kilometer scale, while the important processes determining the dynamics of the atmosphere are in clouds, and those clouds and those movements are at a meter scale. This just means, in the end, that there is a fundamental uncertainty about our knowledge about the future of the climate system, because there's no way in our computers, and these are the kind of supercomputers that are being used. This is the supercomputer that was used at the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, where also climate models have been run. They will not be powerful enough for the foreseeable future to be able to simulate individual clouds at the climate level scale, which means we will get no closer to certainty in terms of how much warming do we get, for instance, if CO2 is doubling. And that has been a range from 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius since the 1970s. So that uncertainty range has not been narrowed down because of more computer power. So it's really important to know and to realize. I studied some of those processes in my first doctoral dissertation, building these models of convection, and then reflected on the first dissertation, the second dissertation, in terms of what are the uncertainties in these models. If you're interested in that, have a look at that book that came out. But the important graph, I just want to highlight, and this sentence from the IPCC, what does it say in the end about these computer models and what we know about, for instance, how much are people contributing to climate change? That was a major reason why the IPCC was set up in the 1980s, because there was no certainty about human influences. Nowadays, that's different. Here you see graphs where you have computer models that include humans. So the line here is the measured temperatures, global measured temperatures, so a rise in the beginning of the 20th century, or another rise in the second half of the 20th century. And you see computer simulations that include humans and that exclude humans. And what you can see from those graphs is that only if we include the emissions of the greenhouse gases, we can explain this warming over the past 50 years. And it's pretty certain, this is one of the more certain elements of climate science. So it's weird if people want to highlight uncertainties in climate change, that they would still go after are humans causing it, because there are much larger uncertainties about what are the consequences. Will there be more rain or less in particular areas? We don't know. But it's extremely likely, in the last IPCC report of 2013, 95% chance, according to the experts, 95% chance that it's actually humans causing most of this warming. And that's taking into account uncertainties in these models, and they were larger, these uncertainties. People were less kind of willing, even in 2001, to go higher than the 66% chance that humans are actually causing this climate change. But that went up to 90, that went up to 95. And well, I have a prediction. I made this prediction a couple of years ago, but in July of this year, the next report will come out. And it may well be that the conclusion is 99% certain. And this is really like, okay, should we focus a lot of media attention on that one? I don't think so, because this is actually kind of done. It wasn't done yet completely in the 2007 report, where you get these kind of sentences, like most of the observed increase in globally average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentration. So this was a stronger statement. It went up from 66% to 90% certainty. And there were countries at that time, there were big countries at that time that were really not happy with the report being released and with this being the major message that the certainty had really increased significantly. So they kind of wanted to block the sentence from being included. And of course they didn't succeed, because it was in the chapters, it was reviewed, it was a factually correct kind of statement in terms of the judgment of the authors that yes, this is very likely. So then you have to have a diplomatic compromise in the UN. So where both sides, or there's often three sides, there's people that wanted a stronger statement, people wanted a weaker statement, and people that think, well, it's kind of exactly what the state of play is. So then you get these kind of weird sentences that then resolve and make it possible to conclude the meeting very deep in the night. It's 4 a.m. and we have been negotiating for 5 days, and then a consideration of remaining uncertainty is based on current methodologies is then proposed as a compromise footnote, and then all these countries agreed. And what happened subsequently is that they would say, some would say, ah, yeah, the remaining uncertainty is large, and it means that it's just models. It's 95% or 90% certainty, but it's just based on models. Other countries could say, well, it's now 90, next time it will be 95, so it's going up. So you can see here, just wanted to highlight that. This is part of the detailed dynamics of this IPCC. Now I want to move to the philosophical part and use as a kind of example philosopher that I think we can learn from and we can use more in science and religion, and in science, religion, and public policy, and in thinking about climate change. And that's Bruno Latour, a French thinker. This is a book he published in 1991, translated in 1993, We've Never Been Modern, where he highlights this very interesting, I've witnessed this dynamic of these hybrid networks of how you craft, for instance, these kind of summaries and these details, and how politics and how science are interacting and leading to a negotiated result. After that, you won't want to talk about that. So you have separately, you have humans, culture, politics, and on the other hand, you have these reports with the consensus of the UN scientists. You want to separate, let's say, nature and culture in that sense. So Latour has written lots of books starting in the 70s, and this was kind of his breakthrough, an anthropology of scientific laboratory practice, a kind of consolidation in the mid-80s in his Science in Action book, and then he has been working on this for a couple of decades, his kind of metaphysical treatise, An Inquiry into Modes of Existence, subtitle An Anthropology of the Moderns. A largely unreadable but very interesting book, which also kind of was developed the final stages at the same time as he delivered the Gifford lectures in Scotland in 2013, which were published 4 years later as Facing Gaia. And he followed it up also with further books on climate change. What I want to do now, before we close for Q&A, is to briefly go through this Facing Gaia book, because I really think it has not yet attracted the attention it should have. And I really think it's a very, very good kind of starting point for thinking philosophically about science, religion, and public policy in the context of climate change. So There's 8 chapters, 8 lectures. He actually gave only the first 6 and then wrote the other 2 in the same style. And what he does in this book, I'm reinterpreting what he's doing in my own book and offering an exegesis and also kind of an analysis from this transcendental naturalist point of view. But what he is doing, first of all, is focusing on this term nature, highlighting also that with climate, we shouldn't focus so much as a crisis that can easily be resolved. He really shows how fundamental the problem is. And he links that also to our view of nature and our distinction between humans and nature and culture and nature. And he highlights man, of course, belongs to nature. And he proposes, and I'm actually in the end using the word nature for what he says is world. So that's a kind of broader concept where he bases his work there also on William James and the pluriverse of William James, where he kind of shows to people who try to naturalize in the wrong way what kind of you're mixing de facto and de jure, but you will always have to do that because values are also part of nature and also part of the whole equation of the world. And specifically on climate scientists, he gives them the advice that they have to become more political, but they have to be very conscious how they do that, because they have to speak then as people, not so much as scientists in the mode of science. And they cannot just speak for nature. So that's very important to realize that some scientists are really naive in terms of how they speak to politics. And in a sense, scientists have to really become more political, he argues. Then he has this Gaia terminology, which is kind of based on the idea that it's a very complex system, which you cannot really study from the top down. So Latour is a very anti-systems thinker in terms of top-down thinking, but he's very much a bottom-up systems thinker, where he connects this idea of Gaia by Jim Lovelock to all these organisms that regulate, for instance, the temperature or the oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere. Then the second lecture is on the question of how animated is nature, and also focusing on this problem of certainty. So he recognizes, he has studied science from the beginning of his career, and he is the kind of the anthropologist of uncertainty in science. So he's so much aware of the uncertainties in science. And he sees a parallel with fundamentalist religion and particular images of science. And he kind of makes the claim that it's a theological model in a way that crept into the image of science with the capital S, and he analyzes that. And then he says, what I'd want to do, for instance, with this Gaia or the Earth, I don't want to have that, let's say, over-animated or animated with a soul, but I do want to recognize that the Earth, the components, everything that's playing a role here has agency, and there's a history. So in the third lecture, he then goes more into depth about Gaia, where he highlights that in the end, we all as humans are part of this larger system. We have to participate in this geohistory. And in a sense, that's a way we will be naturalized. It's not the wrong way of scientific naturalism, where there's a kind of dead nature, but we are now part of the larger life nature system, and we should see ourselves as part of that. And of course, the term Anthropocene is used as well, where there's a kind of problem that it's not a very simple term in terms of governance, because it doesn't seem that we are able to unify ourselves into a political constituency to make decisions on climate change on these different scales with these different interests and different groups. And he has a nice sentence about that where he says, well, there's a plurality of peoples involved. He's also talking a lot about indigenous people. So we're all endowed with contradictory interests, competing territories, and brought together by warring agencies, not to say warring divinities. So it's a really difficult and nearly intractable problem of how to govern in this situation, but he still has ideas on how to do that. Very much against ideas of what he calls ideas of the globe, and how he sees an interconnection from the 17th century between how politics got instituted, how science got its role, and how religion kind of got instituted at that time in history. In his fifth lecture, where he analyzes the science and religion debate, I think in a very interesting manner, where he has a table at the end. I just want to show it here. A table where he shows, well, there is these wrong images of science and religion that play such a large role in the discussion, which is nature is about laws of nature and religion is about an ordering God. You see all these parallels between these religions. He calls them natural religions. Well, and then he says, if you really look into the practices of science, if you really look into the practices of religion, these images, they don't hold up. And we have to go to this more kind of fine-grained anthropological analysis of how these practices work, and we will find an opening. We will also find an opening for how to deal with climate change. I'm not able to go into any detail here. I'm just reaching the end of what I wanted to tell you from this perspective of Bruno Latour. So his sixth lecture, where he has a very interesting theological analysis of the apocalypse and also of religion and of the end times, and he sees problems with utopia, and he sees also again opportunities of having a kind of more subtle idea of how the apocalypse, how this tension can be kept alive, how you can actually associate religion with uncertainty about the ends. And that's a really useful tool also in dealing with climate change. And then the final two lectures, he goes in a little bit more detail about how in political philosophy you have to think about climate change. And the final one is he has this interesting experiment where he says nation states are old-fashioned and not up to the task, and we need to have representation of indigenous peoples, of the oceans, of we name it. And then they actually had a United Nations style negotiation on texts where there were delegations for all these other elements that were not nations. So with that, I propose to end, and I'm very happy to I have some backup slides as well, if necessary, to put some more bones on the flesh. But I think I already threw in a lot of things there to ponder.
Thank you very much. There were some questions. Now there will be applause, but unfortunately in our virtual world, we cannot do this. There are some questions, some were very specific. There was one question that appeared more than once related to your point about Buddhism. And then the question is, Robert asks, could you please elaborate on the relationship between Buddhism, kinship, and water policy in a Delta context, and how did the outcome differ in Thailand than in the Netherlands?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. So thanks for that question. So the whole point here is about how does the future play a role in decisions in in policy, and how do you deal with alternative futures and scenarios. And what we encountered, what we found, was that in terms of how, let's say, the methodologies that were kind of easily imported in Bangladesh, easily imported in, because they have been colonized also by the Brits, in terms of how you make these decisions in the public administration. Similarly in Vietnam, former French colony, all these kind of public administration tools that we developed in that sense in the West and have been using, they really didn't fit how decisions were made, and how kind of in the end then information policy analysis is being used in this Thai setting. It's not a completely black and white thing, because of course Thailand is a very westernized and modernized country in many respects, but it's yeah, it's all I want to add on that. There's a whole paper we wrote on it, but let's leave it at that one.
There was another question that asked, it was very specific about the new nuclear reactors that will use molten fluoride salt, so different kind of nuclear technology. I guess the question is in terms of, is this something that we can know the impact of? And because those, I don't know anything about it, so, but those are supposed to produce less waste and be way more efficient.
Yeah, there's a long history in, let's say, intrinsically safe nuclear reactors, smaller modular nuclear reactors, and also, for instance, thorium reactors that don't produce materials that you can use in bombs. So there is a world out there of research in terms of nuclear reactors. Not so much in the end has reached this kind of stage where it's actually being done, right? So this, they still build new nuclear power reactors on the old kind of ideas and designs. So in principle, yes, if you develop a technology that has intrinsic safety, has let's say no proliferation risk, I would say keep going. Yeah, it's one other thing with nuclear energy. It's of course very much also connected to how do you want to organize a state. It's a kind of a very militarized kind of operation, and you also cannot quickly switch on and off. So yeah, it's a kind of, it's for base load. So you have to let's say balance what you have in a grid. But yeah, I think I have no objections personally in the sense to continuing with some forms of nuclear energy. But there's risks. There's large risks if we expand, let's say, nuclear energy capabilities even more. If you can build a nuclear power plant, if you master that technology, you can build a bomb. So for me, there may be alternatives, but even there, I would like to, I would prefer to have a world where that technology is less important.
There's another question. This is from a biology student, undergraduate biology student, asking about how can scientists who are novice scientists engage in the political. The student asks in terms of, do I have to now take a degree in political science on top of my biology degree so that I can engage in political activity as well?
So let me first, I just saw another one popping up in the chat, and of course didn't want to let's say make it a small thing, but yeah, nuclear waste is the unsolved problem of many of the nuclear energy technologies too, so I wanted to add that as well. So in general, I would downplay nuclear energy, just to be clear. So on that question, what was the last part of it?
Well, how
as a young scientist, or more generally,
yeah,
how to engage with politics. So I think it's it's if you study it already at the university level, the problem in the Netherlands, for instance, if you study these kind of things, we don't have this American style liberal arts colleges, right? So you delve into the climate science, you only do that, you don't learn anything about any other subject. So first of all, the advice is make sure in your education that you have a wide range of topics, but also include, for instance, some policy or politics oriented kind of courses to really have an idea. There are many scientists that don't even know, that didn't really do civics classes properly, in a sense, right? They really don't know how decisions are made. So make sure that you do know that. Then the other role you can play is you can become a trusted advisor to political, to parties, to NGOs. There's very many opportunities, very many avenues where they do need scientific expertise that are mobilized then in the political debate. So don't be shy and don't be afraid of it will be problematic for your scientific reputation if you engage with, for instance, environmental NGOs.
Thank you. If I may jump in, if you can give us your philosophical take on, and this is really not my way of thinking about those things, but I hear this kind of objection often. I think I heard it in the background of your comment on nuclear energy. And this is now, I'm oversimplifying things, but in terms of how we as human beings are technological, our very being has to do with tool use. It seems as if we, every issue we encounter, we respond to it technologically. So, and that in itself has in it built that sense in which if there is a problem, we have to answer that problem through technology. However, in this case, we seem to be confronted with something that is a byproduct of our technology. This whole issue of our impact on our environment, most visible in many different ways, but most visible for us in the data you showed about the impact that our behavior has on the climate. So, philosophically, it seems as if we are trying to do more of what seemed to have brought us to where we are. And again, this is really not my way of thinking about things. I'm asking this because I myself have a hard time answering this in a clear way in terms of how can more technology solve something that was actually caused. And we hear that from many environmentalists who would like to pull back from things and do less technological intervention. So philosophically, how do you think about those things?
Yeah, so I see the same, and I see it with climate change that people try to then geoengineer our way out of it, right? So why don't we cool the planet? Why don't we just make it an air-conditioned machine? That people actually think that, or some people think that, and there's a deeper philosophical analysis which I agree with, that this technology invokes new technology, and we keep continuing on that line, which is why philosophically I have this wider view from philosophy of culture, where you really show that all these different domains of culture have this fundamental influence on how the problem in the end unfolds, right? So that it does include also how we think about the future in terms of fiction. What's the world we want to live in? It includes all these other elements like how we think about distribution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in the end, I think we need technology, but it's not going to be only technology, and it is definitely shouldn't be inappropriate technology. So it's part of the equation, but it's part of 10 other factors or more in terms of our culture, how we address this problem that come into play as well.
Thank you.
There's a question on, I haven't opened the chat yet. It's colonial history in indigenous cultures. Yes. So that's one of my main research questions now as well in terms of, and the tour deals with that as too. How do you kind of you have this global kind of way where you attribute the responsibilities for solving a problem, but there are peoples that have nothing to do with causing the problem and are severely affected by already the present consequences and also for what's coming. So instead of just saying, well, this is tragic, this is actually more than tragic. This is very deeply what requires this complete change in the Western view of what's a human, what's nature, precisely also to be able to start diplomacy with other peoples that didn't kind of do what we did and didn't have that worldview. So I think that's a very, very, very good point, to think about climate change through the lens of colonial history and indigenous cultures. It's squarely within this interdisciplinary intersection and deserves more work. So anybody who's interested in working in that, I would really stimulate that.
Thank you. There was also a question about green parties that exist in many countries. This is, of course, asked from our US context, where such parties are not really prominent as much as they are maybe in some European countries. So the question is, what can they do to obtain more influence in regards to their positions, and can they invoke religion to obtain influence?
Wow, that's really interesting. I haven't been engaged with, let's say, strategizing with or for green parties, because they're doing pretty well. Maybe even in Germany, there may be a Bundeskanzler who comes from the Green Party if things play out in that direction. So that must be really weird from the perspective of the United States. So in terms of Green Party, I think in the Netherlands we had this combination of socialist and green. So in that sense, there was this trial to try to merge, let's say, caring for, let's say, weak parts of human population and environments. That was a success strategy for a while. What doesn't necessarily work is saying science tells us we need to do this or we need to do that. So you have to have a political view that is inviting enough to your population. So politics is getting a group behind you. So and in the United States, I would say, so I've done a paper on evangelical voices on climate change and what is motivating parts of the US population to do something with climate change. And there are inroads there. They were very much concerned in those communities about people and inequality, more than, let's say, nature per se, in nature conservation. So there are ways, again, similar to what I said about this Dutch Green Party. You may be able to connect with other topics that speak also to a religious audience.
There's also a comment, I guess, about developing skills from school children all the way to the higher education and professional levels. So, but you told us already about how important it is to understand that there's this multiverse of views and how all of those contributors you mentioned in those debates at UN, they are all acculturated in that same process. So I guess the comment is that school children, we can actually decide to how to program our population or how to educate our population for a particular goal. Are we then doing this kind of political intervention even in our educational system? So do we just teach science and then expect people to find their political affiliation at one point, or do we explicitly commit ourselves to this or that, religious view, ideological view, political view, and then imbibe our whole educational system with it?
Yeah, wow. I would always like to have some grounding where disciplines are taught as disciplines. So it's really good to have some scientific basis. You don't have to go all the way to a PhD to participate in these debates. But yes, there needs to be a grounding. And it would be great in schools if somehow in the curriculum it's possible to have these kind of problem-oriented exercises where you have to do a task, where you have a contribution from your science class combined with a contribution from your history class or social studies. So those are the kind of tricks, I think, for people to leverage what they have learned in science to see through that it's not just that, right? So they may learn something in science, but that doesn't tell them what to do about a particular problem. So it may partly motivate. There's this interesting development, of course, in people trying to teach the people the story, the epic of evolution from a science perspective, and then trying to have a kind of culture around that, a cult, a liturgy, a kind of religion. And of course, there's an interesting background in the organizations that Mladen and I are associated with of, let's say, natural religion and religions of nature and things like that. And that's another interesting thing that partly in schools, it may well be an interesting exercise to see what you can do with that. I don't know.
Well, I know it is after midnight for you, and I know there are many things that can be said about this. So I really want to thank you for taking part in this event for us at Elmhurst University. It means a lot. I just heard a comment from a professor here who teaches in our program in environmental studies. And her comment had to do with how many of those aspects of what has to be done are integrated into one program here at Elmhurst University, so including political science and not so much religion, though. And then I want to thank everyone for attending, and please take a look at our list of cultural events that are offered through Elmhurst University, and I'm glad that you were able to attend this lecture. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that we cannot get to all your questions. There were some very detailed comments that were posted there. This lecture itself will be posted on Elmhurst University YouTube channel in a couple of days. So if you look at our YouTube channel, you can find many other lectures that we had in this season and previous seasons. So thank you very much for attending, and have a nice rest of your day.
Well, thanks for listening. It was a pleasure to do this. So thanks all.